right, welcome back to Rock Doc's Reading Room. And as you know, I'm serializing my book, Rock Doc. And where did we leave off? All right, I'm working for D. Anthony, who's the manager of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And I am out on a very large Emerson, Lake and Palmer American tour. And through a series of circumstances, I've kind of become the road manager. So let's pick up from there and see where we go. All right, need my glasses, we're all getting older. Okay, so late in March, when we played the convention center in Miami, Greg told me someone was flying in from London whom he wanted me to meet. What I didn't know was that ELP had been looking for a new manager to replace my boss, D. We arrived at the sound check, and Greg walked me over to a well-dressed gentleman sitting alone in the front row. He had medium-length dark hair and looked to be a little older than I was. His arms and legs were crossed, and he wore a stern expression. Greg introduced me to Stewart Young, the group's new manager, a chartered accountant and graduate of the London School of Economics. When ELP had started looking for a new manager, Stewart's father, who was their accountant, suggested it could be a good job for him. Stewart was unsure at first because he knew little about the business. The band assured him he would be fine and sent him to New York to get some advice. I did a podcast with Stewart, which I will post. Stewart and I are still friendly. I had about an hour conversation with him yesterday. He's holed up in London right now. At any rate, I didn't know what was coming. Stewart was there, and you'll hear more about Stewart as time goes on. As I said, we've known each other for over 40 years, and he went on to an amazing career as a manager, and he still is a rock and roll manager. But I'll talk about him in a minute. Somebody else I want to introduce you to. Stewart's first stop was at the office of Frank Barselona, the head of Premier Talent, which was the band's booking agency. Now, I have to stop and talk about Frank Barselona. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the name or have any idea who Frank was. But I'll tell you a little story about who Frank was. Frank started out as an agent at some booking agency, but then in 1964, he saw what was going on and he knew rock and roll was the next big thing. And so he started the first rock and roll booking agency called Premier Talent. And what Frank did, which was so incredible, was he would he developed relationships with promoters all over the country. And then he would encourage these promoters to present emerging young artists, right, at their local venues, which created the foundation of the modern day rock and roll business. He would package tours. He had many groups. And he would sell these package tours with 3 groups and things like that. It was really innovative at the time, and Frank was an incredible guy. He was a real gentleman. He was real hands-on. He would show up at the gig. The groups just loved him and respected him. And I'll just tell you a quick personal story. I maintained a relationship with Frank after I left the music business and I went to medical school in Mexico. And while I was in Mexico, I had this crazy idea. I knew some people who had what they felt was pre-Columbian art. And so I knew that Frank was the largest private collector, certainly in the United States, maybe in the world, of pre-Columbian art. And so we had a relationship, and I said, I have access, whatever. And he was a real gentleman about it. I went to his house. I think he lived in Connecticut, a beautiful estate. We had a great afternoon. Turned out my stuff was fake, of course. But Frank was a real gentleman about it. He was a great guy, and he was this super important guy in the development of the modern day rock and roll business. All right. So Frank impressed upon him, Stewart that is, the need for an experienced tour manager. Greg had filled Stewart in about my role, so he knew the tour was running smoothly and the band was happy. That was enough for him. And he offered me the job as full-time tour manager for Emerson, Lake and Palmer. The group based themselves in London, so I would have to move to the UK. It was a big decision. Things were going well with D, and I didn't think I was ready to leave him yet. You can imagine the dilemma that I faced. I mean, D was a giant. And what I loved about working for D was that he would take me with him. You know, that's how I met Frank Barselona, of course, and that's how I met Bill Graham. Although I had met Bill Graham earlier because he loved Edgar Winter, and you know, through D and Frank, you know, as I went on the road with different groups, I would see these same promoters. I would develop relationships, and then, you know, D would occasionally show up on the road, and being in meetings with all these guys, you know, I just learned the business from the guys who really made the business, and that was incredibly interesting and important. All right. At first, I couldn't understand why the band had hired Stewart. And again, Stewart was this accountant. His father had been their accountant. Stewart was looking to get in the business, since he had no experience in the music business. But many of the people involved in management had a background as either lawyers or accountants. And that's where Stewart certainly had the right pedigree. As I got to know him, I realized he was a very shrewd businessman with a gift for numbers. I liked Stewart. He was a bit arrogant, but that could serve him well as a negotiator, and he loved music. That was what we had most in common. And after a short while, I understood why the band had chosen him. So, a little bit about Stewart. He managed Emerson, Lake and Palmer from then until the band ended, and he also managed the individual members for various periods of time. Greg Lake up until his death, and he helped Keith out, Carl for periods of time here and there. But Stewart went on to manage other people. He managed Billy Squire, he managed Cyndi Lauper, and then he had a 10-year run as manager for AC/DC. Incredible stories, really incredible stories. I mean, and an amazing guy. Now he manages Foreigner and this great Italian artist named Zucchero that you may or may not know. Check him out on YouTube. As a matter of fact, Zucchero's done some great things during the pandemic in Venice and in Rome, and there's some great videos out there about that. But Stewart is just this incredible guy, great stories. Again, I'll post the podcast. Right when the band hired him, they had gotten a label deal through Atlantic. They were forming their own label, Manticore Records. And so actually when I went over to Europe, I was more than just a tour manager. I had responsibilities for everything they did in a live performance, in any way in a live performance. And also that's when I really got to know the Big M, because Stewart took the Big M out of Atlantic and hired him to run the label, Manticore Records. And if you follow me, you know who the Big M is, and you've heard the stories of the Big M. So that's how he came into the picture. All right. So Stewart stayed with the tour for a few days while I gave the decision to leave D a lot of thought. In the end, I felt the opportunity to live in Europe and work for one of the biggest bands in the world was too good to pass up, and I accepted the offer. But first, we had to finish the tour. Tours in those days were brutal, grueling, and you didn't have 3-4 days in between. We had a small Learjet for the plane, which was a pain in the ass in some ways because there were limited seats, and group members always wanted to bring someone, if you know what I mean. And I always had to sort that out, and that was a pain. But, you know, the distance between gigs is what determined when the next gig could be, because we had lots of equipment, and the trucks were driving. They weren't flying, so they had to be able to make the distance, but it was still incredibly grueling. So it was April 15th, Philadelphia, April 17th, Detroit, April 18th, Dayton, April 19th, Chicago, April 20th, Kent State University, April 21st, Louisville, April 22nd, Fort Worth. On it went. And we were only halfway through. I mean, it was a real education for me. I'd been out with Edgar, I'd been out with these groups, but this was a different experience. Managing large numbers of people with so much equipment was not an easy task, especially with the lack of simple tools like cell phones and computers. Remember, this was 1972. A big part of being a tour manager was managing logistics, and I was good at it. You're hearing the birds in the background, a lot of baby birds around, and I feed the birds. During summer vacations, I had worked for my father in one of his warehouses. My father had a trucking and warehousing business. Trucks came loaded with goods that needed to be sorted and moved out to multiple destinations. It had been a lesson in logistics. One summer, I was working for him, and he had the contract to deliver all the school books to all the schools in the 5 boroughs of New York. Because every year, each of the companies would ship all the new books. But they weren't sorted by school or districts or anything. It was sorted by company. So I had to figure out a system in the warehouse where the truck would come in, and then in taking the books off, we would put them in bins designated by district and school, so that when we loaded trucks out, the truck would be loaded in such a way that it could do a route in a short period of time. So I was pretty good at that, and that came in very handy during that period of time. I also loved the challenge of getting the group on stage every night. Edgar Winter and Jerry LaCroix had often been at odds before shows, to the point where a few times Jerry refused to go on. I had learned how to be a good mediator so that both sides felt they gained something and peace prevailed. The situation was different with Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. There were 3 of them, and each thought he was the star attraction. Keith Emerson, with his outrageous equipment and stage antics, stole much of the attention. But that didn't stop Carl and Greg from demanding equal treatment. When the 3 were at odds, it was usually about business matters such as where and when to tour or the type and cost of production. Getting one of them to compromise required finesse and was a delicate balancing act. It got so bad that on one of the later tours that I was on with them, each one of them had a different limousine. They didn't even want to ride together, but I'm sure many of you out there have been in bands and you know the story. At any rate, that's where I'm going to stop. I will continue next Monday. A little preview. I take the job with ELP. I'm off to Europe, and we're almost immediately on a European tour. And so we'll talk about that next time. What else can I say? All right, that's it for today. You know where to find me, and next week another episode of Rock Doc's Reading Room. All right, have a great week, and I'll see you real soon. Bye now.